But the normative, except for those two occasions, is intelligent, normal, human language. That's the way it appears in Acts chapter 2, glossa, because that's what its normal meaning is. Further, the word dialecto, from which we get the English word dialect, also appears in Acts 2, 6, and 8. There you have the word dialect. Some of them heard in their own language, some in a dialect, which is a subgroup of a language. So they were speaking languages and dialects. That's very clear. Those classifications would never be used if babble or ecstatic speech or some kind of spiritual gobbledygook or the kind of pagan speech that was normative to pagan cults was being done. But rather they were normal languages and dialects known to the people who heard. And then you hear people say, well, yes, we agree with that in the book of Acts, but as it goes along further, it changes. No, it doesn't change. If you look at Acts chapter 10 and verse 44 and following there, the Holy Spirit fell on them who heard the word, and they of the circumcision who believed were astonished, as many as came with Peter, because on the Gentiles also was poured out the gift of the Holy Spirit, for they heard them speak with what? Languages. Now, you can't say, well, now by now it's turned into babble. No, it's languages. It's the same word. And further, look at chapter 11, verse 15. Peter, reporting back to Jerusalem, says this of that incident I just read. He says, as I began to speak in Cornelius' house there in chapter 10, the Holy Spirit fell on them as on us at the beginning. And I remembered the word of the Lord that he said, John baptized with water, but you'd be baptized with the Holy Spirit. For as much then as God gave them the what? The what? Same gift. He gave them the what? The same gift. Peter said they got the same thing we got. What did we get? Languages. What did they get? Languages. Had to be the same. It was the same thing. And it proceeds to be that way throughout. So when you come to chapter 19 of Acts and you find a similar situation, again, you can translate it languages. That's its point, chapter 19, verse 6. And when Paul laid his hands on them, the Holy Spirit came and they spoke with languages. Same term, means the same thing in the same book. There's no reason to think it means babble. So throughout the book of Acts, there is a complete consistency insofar as the fact that they spoke normal human language. And the point was, you see, once it happened in Jerusalem, the Jews said, we received the Holy Spirit in this marvelous thing. Well, God says, that's nothing. So did the Gentiles. And he put the church together. And that's nothing. Chapter 19, so did the disciples of John the Baptist. And the Lord is giving all groups the same experience to weld the whole church into one unit. And it has to be the same. All right, let me give you another reason that I believe it's always languages. In 1 Corinthians 12, verse 10, you see this word, the end of verse 10. You see there, gene, glosson, kinds of languages. And then you see, to another, the interpretation of languages. Do you see that? Hermeneuo, for you Greek students, means translation. It simply means translation. So notice now, stay with me on this. He gave the kinds of languages, and to another, the translation of languages. That is the normative Greek word for translation. For translating. It can't be babble then, because you can't translate babble. It's not any language. And so what people today have done, they say the gift of interpretation, and they try to interpret somebody's babble, but the Greek word means translation. And translating is taking something in one language and putting it into its equivalent in a known language. And you can't translate babble. So the very word that is used demands that a language be in view. Further, the word in chapter 14, unknown. Do you see it? Unknown here and unknown there. It's in verse 2 and it goes on, unknown, unknown. It's always in italics. You know what that means? That means it was added by our friends on the King James Committee, to whom we are not indebted for that particular act, but they added it. But it isn't in the original. Now I want you to notice too that in chapter 12 verse 10 you have kinds of languages, kinds of languages, kinds of languages. The word kinds is basically the word genos, from which we get genus. And genus means a family or a group or a race or a nation. You can't say there are kinds and races and classes and groups and families of babble, of ecstatic speech. There aren't any classifications, but there are language families, aren't there? Any of you who know linguistics know there are language families. There are national languages, racial languages. So it fits, it has to be language. In chapter 14, verse 21, another reason we know it to be languages. In the law it is written, with men of other tongues and other lips will I speak unto this people, and yet for all that will they not hear me. Now Isaiah predicted this, Isaiah 28, 11 and 12. Isaiah predicted that men of other languages would speak to Israel. You know who fulfilled that? The Assyrians. Do you know what they spoke? Assyrian. So the prophecy had reference to a known language, Assyrian, spoken by Assyrians. And that is the normative standard. He says that's the thing that's happening today in the legitimacy of languages. It is another language being spoken to the people, and it was normative to be a language since its example was a real language. Look at verse 7 of chapter 14. Even things without life, he says, like flutes and harps, unless they give a distinction in the sound, how is it going to be known what's piped or harped? And if the trumpet gives an uncertain sound, who's going to prepare to battle? Can you imagine the U.S. cavalry out to fight the Indians, and a guy just goes out and blows any old few notes he wants? They wouldn't know what to do. It's got to be da-da-da-da, or whatever they did. You know, hit the horses, guys. You know, they knew what the deal was. It's got to be the right thing. You get into the service, you know what means what. If the guy got out in the morning and just blew a few notes of his own choice, nobody'd know what was going on. It's got to have structure. It's got to have format. It's got to have distinction. And that's the point that he's saying. Languages has to have structural distinction to make sense. It can't just be this pagan babble. And what had happened was that the Corinthians had translated the ecstasies and the babble and the speaking in these strange ecstatic languages that were no language. They had translated that into their church, and they had counterfeited the true gift of languages with this ecstasy that was tripping them out and turning their worship service into an orgy. Look at verse 23 of 14. This is another very salient point. It says, if the whole church comes together to one place and you all speak with languages and somebody comes in who is unlearned or an unbeliever, will they not say you're mad? In other words, he says, if you have all of this wild hysteria going on, if everybody's up doing his own gig, you're going to have some problems because unbelieving people are just going to think you're nuts. It's not going to have any effect on them. Why? Now listen. The amazement element for non-Christian Jews attending their services depended upon the fact that the thing that was spoken was a real